Okay, so now that we have all of these routes for loading data from our server, you may have noticed that until now, we've had to manually restart our server every time we made a change to our code in order for those changes to take effect, right? So if we have our server listening and we make a change up here, well, that change isn't going to take effect until we manually stop our server and restart it. And of course, in Codespace, that requires us to open up this ports thing and set the port to public each and every time. And that's obviously a little bit annoying to have to do. So what we're going to take a look at is how to use a package called Nodemon in order to help us automatically restart our server in response to changes. So what we're going to do here is stop our server, and inside our backend directory, we're going to say npm install save dev. And we're going to install, as I said, a package called Nodemon, which is spelled like that, and there are different pronunciations for this. So that's just the way I say it. So let's hit enter, and that's going to install that package for us. And now that we've done that, what we should be able to do is run our server continuously, right, and see it automatically updated. And the way we do that is by saying npx nodemon exec. And then after that we're going to say the original command that we used to run our server. So that's going to be npx babelnode and then the path to our file, source/server.js. And yes, that is a slightly long command there. I'll show you in just a minute here how we can make that shorter. So let's hit enter though, and what we should see is that, sure enough, we have all of this new output. That's just all from Nodemon. And after that, we see that it says server is listening on port 8000. So now what we should be able to do is go over to our ports, and we're going to have to set this port to public again. So we'll just say port visibility public. And there we go. We should now be able to send a request to this from Postman, so let's open up Postman and we'll just send the same request that we were sending earlier by clicking send. And sure enough, we see that we get the same result. And if you want to test out this automatic restart, what you can do, first of all, let's just open up the terminal so that we can see that automatically refresh. What we can do is just have our product ID endpoint, which we were just sending that request to. We'll just comment out all of the code that contains. And for now, just for testing purposes, we'll say response.json, and we'll say hello again. Okay, so let's save that, and what you're going to see is that as we save that file, which I've done automatically several times just in Codespaces here, the server automatically restarts, and again, we see server is listening on port 8000. And one thing that we are going to have to fix here is you'll see that even though Nodemon has automatically restarted for us, it set the visibility back to private. And that's because it very briefly stopped the service and restarted it. So what we have to do is just add a port manually, alright, and that's going to be 8000 here. And here, we can actually delete this port above it. Alright. So we're going to manually add port 8000. And now if we set the visibility to public, okay, it should stay that way. So let's just try this one more time. We'll add something simple like a semicolon and hit save, and what we should see is that the server will automatically restart. And then back in ports we'll see that the visibility is still public, which is exactly what we wanted. So now we can go back to Postman, click send, and we'll see that updated response that says hello again. And now if we go back and change it back to what we had before by deleting that hello again response and uncommenting this code and clicking save, then we'll still see that the port stays public. And again, we'll see that the server has restarted. And now if we go back and send that same request, we'll see that we get back the same product as before. Now, one last thing that I wanted to mention here is that since this command is pretty long to have to run each and every time we want to start up our server, even if we only have to do it, let's say, once a day while we're developing, there's a way that Node.js provides us with for creating shortcuts. And all we have to do in order to make that happen is open up our backend folder and then package.json. And do make sure you're opening up package.json in the backend folder, not in the frontend folder. And then what we're going to do is find this script section, and you'll see that there's already one script in there called test. That's just a basic script that is automatically provided for us by Node.js. And what we're going to do is underneath that, well, first of all, make sure to add a comma to the end of that test line because otherwise it won't work. Underneath that, we're going to say dev. And then, as a string, we're just going to copy this command, write, npx nodemon exec, blah, blah, blah. And we're going to paste that in the string there so that this dev script is now this longer script here, right? So basically what this has done is it's created a shortcut for us so that instead of having to remember and run that long command every time, we can now just say npm run. And then the name of the script we just created, which is dev here, and that will be a shortcut for that command, right? So you can see that just by running that now, it says server is listening on port 8000, and sure enough, if we go back to ports, we see that it's even still visible now that we've stopped our server and restarted it. So anyway, that's how to use Nodemon to automatically restart our server in response to updates. Alright, so now that Nodemon is automatically restarting our server for us, the next thing that we're going to do is create some more endpoints on our server, and these are going to be the endpoints for managing the user's shopping cart. So we're going to create two endpoints here. One for adding an item to the user's cart and one for removing an item from the user's cart. So, here's what that's going to look like. We're going to say app post. So this is the endpoint for adding an item to the user's cart. And we're using a post request just because that's a very common convention that's used when creating server-side resources. And for the URL here, we're going to say, /cart. And just as another side note, it is possible to have two different endpoints with different types of requests, such as post or get with the same URL. So, we have this one up here for loading the cart, this one down here for adding an item to the cart, and that's perfectly fine. Alright, so let's now add the callback function, which takes the request and response objects as arguments. And those objects, by the way, both contain information about the request and the response respectively. And as we've already seen, this response object contains a lot of tools and methods that we can use to send back a response to the client side. Such as, when we say response.json product. That tells our server to send back a response with that data inside of it. So, what we're going to do here is we're going to need to add an item to the cart, but what we're going to have the user include. What we're going to have the client side include in this request is the ID of the product that they want to add to their cart. So if we go back and take a look at our products on our backend. If we take a look at this temp.data.js file, what we're going to see is that remember that each of these items has an ID. So what we're going to have the client side do is include that ID with this request, and that ID is going to be included as part of the request body. So, this is something we haven't talked about yet, but if you take a look at Postman and go to this body tab, well, with any request that we send, it's possible to send along extra data with the request. And this can be used for a variety of purposes. In our case here, we're going to use that to include the idea of the product we want to add to the cart. So, what you're going to want to do is select body, select the body tab up here, then select raw from the radio buttons. And over here on the side, you're going to select JSON from the drop-down. So, what we can do now is specify a JSON payload or request body inside of this text editor here. And what we're going to do is just give it the property ID and the value for that. We'll try doing 123. So in other words, this request here would tell the server that we want to add the item with ID 123 to our cart. So that's what the request is going to look like. So back on our server, what we're going to want to do is get that ID, and here's how we do that. Remember that with our URL parameters, we were able to just say, request.params.producted. Well, we can do something very similar with a request body. We can just say const product ID equals request.body.id. Alright, so we gave it the key ID. So that's what we use to access it here. alright? And once we've gotten the product ID, we're going to find the product with that ID. So here's what that's going to look like. We're just going to say const product equals and then just like we did up here. We're going to copy this products.find thing and paste it there because we're doing the exact same thing. And once we've found the corresponding product, we're going to add that to the user's cart. Now, currently, since we have this data in another file, in our temp data file, we're not going to be able to directly modify it. So, an easy way around that is to simply rename these up here. So we're going to say cart items as cart items and then we'll just call it raw. And then we'll do the same thing with products. We'll say products as products raw. And now what we can do is underneath there, we can just create two local variables here that we'll be able to manipulate by saying let cart items equals cart items raw and let products equals products raw. So now that we have those, we should be able to modify these just the way we want to. So, let's go back down to our new endpoint. And what we're going to do is just say cartItems.push. And we're going to add that new product to the cart. So, as a response now, all that we're going to do is send back the updated cart items to the client. And we can do that just by saying response.json cart items, and that should be all we need to do for this endpoint for now. So, let's test this thing out. What we're going to want to do is make sure, first of all, that our server is running, and yep, sure enough it is, we don't see any errors. So let's go back to Postman now and send a post request, which you can select from this drop down here, and we're going to send that to /products with this request body specified. So what that should do is add the product with ID 123 to the user's cart, and we should see that added to the array that we get back in the response. So, let's click send, and oops, we get back an error saying cannot post products. That is because we didn't send it to /cart. So that was just a mistake on my part. Let's try that again. And oh, we see that we got another error. Now this error is actually one that I expected, and it's a very common one to get when you start working with request bodies. You see that the error says cannot read properties of undefined. And the place where that's happening is when we try and access request.body.id. In this case, body is actually undefined. And the reason for that is that Express by default will not parse the request body for you unless you tell it to. So, the way that we can tell it to is by saying app use, and then we're going to say Express.json with parentheses after it. And that should fix the error that we were getting. So let's try this again. We're going to go back and hit send. And sure enough, we see that we get an updated cart back from the client side. So, we see that this now has product with ID 123 added to the bottom of the array. Alright, so now that we have this new endpoint for adding items to the user's cart, the next thing that we're going to do is add the endpoint for removing items from the user's cart. So what this is going to look like is we're going to add another endpoint, and this is actually going to be a delete endpoint. So we had a get endpoint for loading the cart up here, we had a post endpoint for adding items to the cart. And we're going to have a delete endpoint, which is just another request type for removing items from the cart. Alright, and the actual path for this endpoint is going to be /cart, and then it's going to include a request parameter, which will include the ID of the product we want to remove from the cart. So that's what the path is going to look like. It's going to be /cart/producted. And now for the callback, which again is going to have request and response object arguments. What we're going to do inside of here is basically just filter our products array so that it only contains items that do not match this product ID URL parameter. So let's get the value of that parameter here. We're going to say const product ID equals request.params.producted. And this is just like what we did up here for loading an individual product, by the way. And then underneath that what we're going to do is say products equals products, and then we're going to use JavaScript's built-in filter function, which allows us to get all of the items in an array that fit a certain criteria. So sort of like products.find, but instead of allowing us to get a single product, it allows us to get all of the products that match that criteria. So what we're going to do here is say that we only want the products whose ID does not match this product ID URL parameter. So what that's going to look like is we're going to say product.id does not equal product ID. OK. And that will remove all of the products with this ID from our products array. And actually, instead of products here, this should be cart items. Okay, so I got a little bit mixed up there. But that should be cart items equals cart items dot filter because the cart items are what we want to filter here, not the products. So the next thing that we want to do is send back the updated cart items just like we did in the create endpoint up above. So we'll say response.json, cart items. Like so. And now, if we go back and test this out, we should be able to open up Postman and we don't need the request body here, so we can just change that to none. We're going to change the request type to delete from the drop-down up at the top. And we're going to send this to /cart123 and this should have the effect of removing all of the items from our cart with the ID 123. So let's click send and what we see in the response is that, sure enough, we only have items without that ID left in our cart. So that's how we create an endpoint for removing items from our cart. At this point, we have all the major endpoints for our server created. So the last thing that we're going to do before we move on to seeing how to add a database to our application is we're going to see how to rethink the shopping cart to make it less repetitive. So let me explain what I mean by that, first of all. If we take a look at the current structure of our cart items array and our products array, notice that there's a lot of repeated data, right? We have the same data for all of the products in here, the ID, the name, the price, and so on. And then in products, we have the same exact thing. So in order to avoid this kind of repetition, what we're going to want to do is simplify the way we store the user's shopping carts, so that we only have one single source of truth for our data. So essentially, what we're going to do is instead of storing the entire objects, right, instead of storing all of the product data in our cart items, we're going to change our cart items array so that it only stores the IDs of the items that are in the user's cart. And then what we'll do is when the user wants to see their cart, we'll just populate those IDs, right? That is, find the corresponding products for each of those IDs and send that populated array back to the user. So here's what that's going to look like. In our cart items array, we're just going to add the IDs of a few of our items, and we can just add 2 for the time being. 123 and 345, which correspond to these 2 products as you can see in our products array. And this is going to mean, of course, that we're going to have to rewrite some of our endpoints. So let's go over to our server.js file. And all of the endpoints basically that have to do with the cart, so this loading endpoint as well as the add item endpoint and the remove item endpoint are going to need to be slightly reworked to take into account this new format. So what we're going to want to do here is we'll start off with our load cart endpoint. And since our cart, remember, is now just IDs, we're going to have to actually populate each of those IDs with the product that it represents. So here's what that's going to look like. We're going to use JavaScript's built-in map function to map each ID to its corresponding product. And what that's going to look like is we're going to say const, we'll just call this something like populated cart. And then we're going to say equals cartItems.map. Here's where we use JavaScript's built-in map function. And as I said, we're going to map each ID to the product it represents, and we can do that by saying products.find. And it's really just the same thing that we did down here. So I'm just going to copy that and paste that inside find. And we're going to find the corresponding product like so. The only difference is that instead of saying product ID, we're just going to change that to ID to match the name of the argument we specified right there. So now that we have the populated cart, we just need to send that back to the user instead of cart items. So let's remove that and replace that with populated cart. And now that we've done that, our cart endpoint should work once again. So let's test this in Postman by sending a GET request to /cart. And instead of the cart IDs, what we should see if we click send is the populated cart items. And you can test this, by the way, just by changing those IDs and seeing if the corresponding products show up for those. But I'll leave that up to you. So let's now go down to our add item to cart and remove item from cart endpoints. These ones are actually going to be a little bit easier than what we saw beforehand. So what we're going to do is, once we've got the product ID from the body, we don't even need to worry about finding the corresponding product here. We can just push that product ID directly onto the cart items array, since again it's now just an array of IDs. Now the one thing that's going to be a little bit different is we are going to have to populate the cart items once again, just like we did up in the load endpoint. But instead of just adding that repetitive code to each of these endpoints, we're just going to create a helper function here. So we'll say function, and we'll call this function populate cart IDs. And what that's going to do is it's just going to take IDs as an argument, right? IDs of products, and it's going to populate those. So we can just take this populated cart line that we had down here in our load cart endpoint and copy and paste that into our populate cart IDs function. And we're just going to say return, and we'll change this to IDs.map. And then we're going to map each ID to its corresponding product. So now instead of having to repeat that logic in all of our endpoints, we can just say something like const populated cart equals populate cart IDs. And we'll pass those IDs as an argument here by saying cart items. Okay, and now we can just do that down here in our add item to cart endpoint. So we have the product ID, we've added it to our cart items array. So we can now just say const populated cart IDs, or populated cart rather equals populate cart IDs, and we'll pass the cart items as an argument there as well. And oops, it looks like I mistyped that. That should be populated cart. And then we'll send that back to the client side. So populated cart. And last but not least, we're going to do the same kind of thing for our remove item from cart endpoint. All that we're going to need to do is remove the corresponding ID that was specified as part of the URL parameter. So now what we'll do is say, cart items equals cart items.filter. And now, we just need to say ID does not equal product ID. And then once again, we'll populate it. So I'm just going to copy and paste this line down here. And then we'll send back the populated cart from this endpoint as well. So now if we save this, we should be able to do those two endpoints just like before. So let's try adding an item to our cart by sending a post request with a request body. And let's try adding product 234 to our cart since that's not already there. So if we send a post request to that endpoint, sure enough, we should see that adds that item successfully and we see it populated in the response. And now if we want to remove an item from our cart, we're just going to send a delete request with no body to /cart/. And let's remove item 345. If we click send now, what we'll see is that sure enough, item 345 is gone. So that's how to refactor the shopping cart to make it so that our data is less repetitive.